what if the profound sense of brokenness we feel in our modern economic systems isn't just, a simple math problem? Like,
Right.
it's not just about the distribution of wealth. What if it's the result of a system that actively ignores, well, essentially 2/3 of your actual human potential?
That is the fundamental question we're tackling today.
Exactly. The premise we are unpacking today challenges the very foundational architecture of how we define a resource, how we define value, and ultimately how we define human capability.
It's a massive scope, really.
It is. You are stepping into an incredibly profound exploration with us today. The text we're dissecting presents this rather magnificent, buzzing optimism about the future of human society, and we are going to subject it to the highest level of intellectual scrutiny.
The premise you just laid out is exactly the kind of paradigm-shifting inquiry that makes this particular source material so compelling to analyze. Because when we look at the trajectory of human history, the academic and political consensus often defaults to a purely material diagnosis of our societal ills, doesn't it?
Oh, almost exclusively. We analyze gross domestic product, or, we measure physical resource scarcity.
Right, we debate tax brackets and interest rates.
Exactly. But the text we are examining today widens the lens quite radically. We are looking at an argument that suggests our entire definition of economics is just, well, woefully incomplete.
Indeed. It's missing the larger picture.
So as a brief overview for you, the listener, we are immersing ourselves today in the writings of Sri P.R. Sarkar. We're focusing heavily on his socioeconomic framework, which is known as PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory.
A fascinating framework, I must say.
Truly. And our mission for this deep dive is to fundamentally examine how this text attempts to expand your view of economics.
Yeah, Sarkar's writing is really attempting to shift the global conversation away from the rather dreary, purely material focus that has dominated both the industrial and post-industrial eras.
Right. It proposes this highly optimistic, deeply synthetic model, one that argues you can't merely manage, coal, steel, and digital data without simultaneously incorporating intellectual and spiritual liberation into the very fabric of society's operating system.
Which is a brilliant way to frame it. An operating system for society.
Exactly. But to truly grasp the architecture of PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, the text insists we must first correctly map the territory of the problem it's trying to solve.
Spot on. You can't cure a disease if you've misdiagnosed it.
Right. And when modern political discourse addresses exploitation, it almost exclusively relies on a physical definition.
Yes, we immediately picture sweatshops, or we picture the monopolization of real estate.
Stagnant wages, that sort of thing.
Precisely. And while Sarkar's text absolutely acknowledges the devastating reality of those physical symptoms, it argues that physical extraction is merely one tentacle of a much more sophisticated organism.
It's just the surface layer.
Exactly. Capitalism in this theoretical framework isn't categorized simply as a financial market mechanism. It's analyzed as a pervasive operating system that actively infiltrates three entirely distinct spheres of human existence.
3 spheres. So let us examine this meticulously. Starting with the sphere we are all undeniably most familiar with, the physical sphere.
The physical realm, yes.
The text posits that the core dysfunction of physical capitalism is essentially mechanical in nature. It occurs when the movement of money or physical wealth is deliberately restricted.
Or immobilized, really.
Immobilized, exactly, in the hands of a microscopic fraction of the population. Now, the hoarding mechanism feels intuitive to me. I tend to think of capital like water in an elaborate agricultural system.
That's a rather good analogy.
Right. Because if you construct a colossal dam and you hoard, say, 90% of the water in a single stagnant reservoir, the wider garden inevitably withers.
It dries up entirely.
Yeah. The plants haven't lost their biological imperative to grow. They want to grow. They've simply been starved of the medium required for growth.
They lack the hydration, the capital to flourish.
Exactly. But here's where I must play devil's advocate for a moment.
Please do.
A strict capitalist would argue that hoarding is actually, saving or capital accumulation. They'd say it's necessary to fund massive, innovative projects. They would argue that without the dam, you cannot generate the hydroelectric power needed to modernize the garden in the first place.
Yes, that is the classic defense. But the text anticipates that exact argument, actually. And it counters it with a principle Sarkar terms optimum mobility.
Optimum mobility.
Right. The argument here isn't against the temporary concentration of resources for large-scale initiatives. Not at all. Rather, it is a critique of structural stagnation.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, if capital is the socioeconomic lifeblood of the collective body, its primary function must be circulation.
Like blood in the veins.
Exactly. When wealth loses its optimum mobility, when it coagulates in offshore tax havens or sits as massive unutilized corporate cash reserves, the extremities of the societal organism begin to suffer necrosis.
Wow. Necrosis. So the outer edges literally die off.
Yes. PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, suggests that an economy must operate much like a healthy cardiovascular system. It demands dynamic, continuous motion to nourish every single cell.
So stagnation is the real enemy here.
Precisely. Stagnation, even when disguised as accumulation, is viewed by this theory as a fundamental violation of economic physics.
That makes perfect sense. The physical mechanics are clear enough. But the text introduces a second sphere that fundamentally reframes the conversation, and that is intellectual capitalism.
Yeah, the psychic sphere.
Now, this concept initially seems a bit contradictory. I mean, how does an economic system hoard intellect? We don't, lock thoughts in bank vaults.
We don't lock them in vaults, no. But the text argues we do sequester them through apathy and elitism.
Apathy and elitism.
Yes. Intellectual capitalism, functioning in this psychic sphere, is defined by Sarkar as a phenomenon where highly educated, intellectually capable individuals systematically withhold their acquired knowledge from the collective welfare.
So they keep it for themselves.
Or for a very select few. Instead of applying their intellect to alleviate the suffering of the masses, they retreat into privileged enclaves.
Like exclusive academic institutions.
Exactly. Or corporate think tanks, highly paid consultancies, that sort of thing.
So it's a critique of the ivory tower, essentially, but taken to its logical economic extreme.
Quite right. The source material notes that capitalists essentially purchase these brilliant minds.
They buy them off.
They do. And by doing so, they neutralize their potential to enact structural change, turning them into specialized tools for wealth generation instead.
I look at modern technology hubs today, and I see some of the greatest mathematical and engineering minds of our generation.
Oh, absolutely. Brilliant people.
But instead of utilizing that brilliance to solve, say, logistical bottlenecks in global food distribution or building clean energy grids, that intellect is purchased to design microsecond trading algorithms for Wall Street.
Or slightly more addictive dopamine loops for social media applications.
Yeah. Exactly. It's an incredible misallocation of human genius. But again, if I may push back slightly.
Go ahead.
Doesn't the system of patents and intellectual property, the very mechanisms of hoarding ideas, doesn't that incentivize these intellectuals to invent in the first place? I mean, if we demand they give their intellect away for the collective welfare, don't we risk killing the incentive to innovate?
That is the central tension, isn't it, between standard market theory and PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory.
Right.
Sarkar's text argues that tying intellectual innovation exclusively to the promise of disproportionate physical wealth is actually a symptom of a degraded societal psyche.
A degraded psyche. Interesting.
Yeah. When the intelligentsia operates solely on the profit motive, the societal symptoms are severe. The text highlights a deliberate underdevelopment of mass literacy and critical thinking, for instance.
Because if knowledge is power, intellectual capitalists maintain power by keeping the populace confused.
Spot on. Furthermore, the source material argues that indigenous socioeconomic consciousness is actively suppressed.
Yeah, the text mentions the cultivation of inferiority and fear complexes among the general population.
It does.
And the mechanics of this make a chilling sort of sense. I mean, if you are deliberately priced out of understanding the legal, financial, or technological mechanisms of your own society.
Because the intellectuals are hidden that knowledge.
Right. Behind paywalls, impenetrable jargon, and, complex user agreements, you naturally become fearful. You feel completely disenfranchised.
And a fearful, confused populace becomes irrationally dependent on dogmatic doctrines. They retreat into what Sarkar calls narrow sentiments.
Narrow sentiments, like geo-sentiment and socio-sentiment.
Exactly. They divide themselves over arbitrary national borders or caste groups. They fiercely fight each other rather than recognizing the artificial scarcity that's been imposed upon them.
And that psychological division is entirely the point, isn't it?
It is the point. The text posits that intellectual stagnancy is the necessary prerequisite for physical exploitation.
Because if they're fighting each other, they aren't fighting the system.
Precisely. Those hoarding physical wealth leverage this rampant irrationality. If the intellect of the general public remains clouded by dogmas, fear, and engineered division, they will never possess the clarity required to challenge the physical hoarding of resources.
The intellectual capitalist provides the smokescreen for the physical capitalist.
Brilliant way to put it.
Which brings us to the third and, frankly, the most unexpected realm analyzed in the text: spiritual capitalism.
Yes, the causal sphere.
When I first encountered this term, it felt like an oxymoron. I mean, spiritual capitalism. The text describes spiritual capitalists as individuals who retreat from society. Historically to mountain caves, but perhaps today to, I don't know, secluded mindfulness retreats.
High-end wellness spas, perhaps.
Right, and they perform arduous practices purely to fulfill their own longing for personal spiritual emancipation.
Yes, they acquire immense spiritual knowledge and tranquility.
But they deliberately choose not to arouse that spiritual awareness in the collective life.
Which forces a profound re-examination of what spirituality is actually supposed to achieve.
It really does.
Because in many historical ascetic traditions, the ultimate goal has often been framed as an individual escape from the suffering of the material world.
A solitary ascent to enlightenment, leaving everyone else behind.
Exactly. But Sarkar's philosophy fundamentally rejects this isolationist view. The text grounds its argument in an ancient philosophical mandate.
Ah, yes. Atma mokartan jagaditayaka.
Which translates to self-realization and service to humanity. According to PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, genuine spirituality is never selfish. It demands social engagement.
The writing states that ignoring the suffering of society is, and I quote, ultra-vires to the very spirit of spiritual practices.
It's a violation of the core contract of enlightenment.
Right. The logic here is that if a spiritualist genuinely perceives that everything in the universe, from the creator down to a microscopic organism, is a manifestation of a singular supreme consciousness, well, how can they possibly turn their back on the suffering of that very consciousness manifesting in the poverty or oppression of their neighbors?
The text argues that they simply cannot. True spiritual leadership requires what Sarkar terms an established state of equanimity.
Equanimity.
Yes. And to achieve and maintain that equanimity, spiritualists are mandated to adjust to what the text poetically calls the dusty earth's level.
The dusty earth's level. I love that phrasing. It means getting your hands dirty.
Exactly. They cannot remain detached observers in the clouds. They must return to the complex, gritty reality of human society, share the wealth of their developed consciousness, and actively engage in lightening the sorrows of humanity.
And if they fail to do this,
then the text categorizes them simply as spiritual capitalists. Individuals hoarding the highest possible form of wealth for their own personal gratification.
it is a devastatingly comprehensive critique. I mean, we have physical capitalism hoarding the medium of survival, intellectual capitalism hoarding the medium of progress, and spiritual capitalism hoarding the medium of meaning.
It covers the entire spectrum of human experience.
It really does. And to genuinely fight exploitation, the text argues we must dismantle the hoarding mechanisms across all three spheres simultaneously.
Which is a monumental task.
Huge. And having diagnosed the three spheres of the disease, the text then transitions to dissecting how this system actively paralyzes a population.
Right, because the system defends itself.
Exactly. If intellectual capitalism is the passive withholding of knowledge, what Sarkar defines as psychoeconomic exploitation is the active, aggressive mechanism used to maintain control.
Yes, the text observes that capitalism is incredibly adaptable.
Highly adaptable. It has mutated from feudalism to laissez-faire industrialism to imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, and modern mixed economies.
And psychoeconomic exploitation is analyzed as its most refined and dangerous mutation to date.
It's the modern weapon. The source material actually lists 8 specific methods of this psychoeconomic exploitation. And rather than just read them as a dry list, let's analyze how they function in reality because the mechanics are quite insidious.
Let's do that.
So the first method identified is the suppression of indigenous language and culture.
A classic colonial tactic.
Right. We have seen this historically during colonial expansions, forcing indigenous populations into assimilation schools, forbidding native tongues.
Because by erasing a language, you erase the conceptual framework a people uses to understand their own worth and history.
Exactly. You literally remove their ability to articulate their own oppression.
Precisely. Now, the second method the text highlights is the extensive propagation of pseudo-culture.
Pseudo-culture.
Yes. Sarkar specifically points to media that debases the mind and saps the physical and mental vitality of the youth.
Now, in a contemporary context, this goes far beyond the text's mention of, say, pornographic literature.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It encompasses the entire hyper-consumerist media environment, the algorithmic feeds designed to foster outrage, superficiality, and reduced attention spans.
Like doom scrolling on social media.
Exactly. If you flood the psychological environment with pseudoculture, the population simply lacks the mental stamina to engage in complex socioeconomic reform. They're just too exhausted and distracted.
Wow. That rings incredibly true today. Now, the third and fourth methods deal with structural suppression. The text cites imposing restrictions on women to force them into economic dependence on men.
Effectively neutralizing the potential of half the population.
Exactly. It's mathematically crippling to a society's progress. And then it points to an unpsychological education system riddled with political interference.
We see this constantly. When education prioritizes rote memorization and compliance over critical independent thought.
You are essentially training workers for the physical sphere, not developing intellects for the psychic sphere.
You're building compliant cogs, not independent thinkers.
Right. Now, the fifth and sixth methods involve the deliberate fracturing of meaning and community. The text argues that the negation of dharma, or foundational unifying spiritual principles, in the name of secularism, leaves a moral vacuum.
A vacuum that is very easily exploited.
Precisely. And it's exploited by the sixth method, the balkanization of society into numerous opposing factions, castes, or political tribes.
Because when a society is fractured along these lines, the resulting infighting prevents any unified resistance against the overarching economic exploitation.
The classic divide and conquer.
Indeed.
And then the final two methods solidify the control. The text critiques unnatural, harmful methods of birth control, framing them within a broader argument against policies that damage the physical and demographic health of a society for economic convenience.
Yes, treating human beings merely as economic liabilities.
Right. And finally, the eighth method, placing the absolute control of mass media, news, television, and the internet firmly in the hands of the capitalist class.
The manufacturing of consent, to borrow a phrase.
Exactly. If you control the information diet of a population, you define the parameters of what they believe is possible.
The crucial analytical insight the text provides here is the chronology of these 8 methods.
The chronology, meaning the order in which they occur.
Yes. Psychoeconomic exploitation is a sequential process. Psychological paralysis inevitably precedes economic subjugation.
Ah, I see.
Think about it. If an exploitative class wishes to extract resources from a population, utilizing brute physical force is immensely costly and inefficient.
Because it breeds immediate violent resistance.
Exactly. The sophisticated approach is to hollow out the population from the inside first, strip their cultural pride, immerse them in vital sapping pseudoculture, fracture their communities, and monopolize their media.
And once the psychological dismantling is complete, the economic extraction meets absolutely zero resistance. The analogy that comes to mind here is biological.
Oh.
Yeah. There are certain parasitic wasps that do not simply attack their host outright. They first inject a highly specific neurotoxin into the host's nervous system.
Fascinating.
And this toxin doesn't kill the host, but it completely paralyzes its defensive instincts. The host remains alive, docile, and compliant while it is slowly consumed.
That is a horrifying yet perfectly apt analogy.
Right. The text argues that phenomena like media monopolies or politically compromised education systems are not accidental failures of society. They are the neurotoxins injected by an exploitative system to ensure we do not struggle while our wealth and time are extracted.
That is the precise mechanism Sarkar describes. And the text's proposed countermeasure is equally psychological.
How so?
It insists that to break this paralysis, society must generate a powerful popular sentiment aimed at liberating the intellect. The intellectuals who have sequestered themselves, the ones we discussed earlier, must overcome their inertia.
They have to come out of the ivory tower.
Yes. They are tasked with mixing with the common people to rebuild the psychological fortitude of the masses, enabling them to recognize and actively reject pseudoculture.
So it's an active, engaged rebellion of the intellect.
Exactly.
Well, this analysis of exploitation is heavy. But as we noted at the beginning, this text is profoundly optimistic at its core. It spends considerable time dissecting the disease, but its primary purpose is to present the cure.
The visionary blueprint.
Yes. So let us shift our focus to the highly progressive synthetic framework for resource management that Sarkar proposes. The entire architecture of PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory, rests upon a foundational concept that radically challenges modern property law.
Cosmic inheritance.
Cosmic inheritance. Let's unpack that.
This concept marks the transition from critique to solution. In virtually all dominant economic models of the past centuries, there is a fundamental obsession with absolute ownership.
Right. This is mine. I own it forever.
Exactly. Capitalist models assert that individuals or corporations can hold absolute eternal dominion over land and resources. Traditional state communist models assert that the state holds that absolute ownership.
But Sarkar's text proposes a paradigm shift.
A massive one. It posits that the universe in its entirety is a common cosmic inheritance.
The legal distinction the text makes here is really fascinating. It argues that human beings do not, and in fact cannot, own resources in the absolute sense.
Because we are essentially temporary visitors.
Right. We're just passing through. What we actually possess are called usufructuary rights.
Usufructuary rights.
Yeah. In legal terms, usufruct is the right to use and enjoy the advantages of another's property, provided you do not destroy or deplete the substance of that property.
It's a profound ethical boundary.
Exactly. And the text applies this concept globally. We have the right to utilize the Earth's resources for our development, but we are absolutely forbidden from depleting them at the expense of future generations.
When we apply this framework to the modern context of, say, environmental degradation and climate crises, the implications are staggering.
It entirely shifts humanity's self-perception.
Yes. We are no longer categorized as conquerors of the natural world, entitled to extract wealth until the soil is sterile and the oceans are depleted. PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, frames us as temporary stewards.
Stewards. I like that.
We are beneficiaries of an intergenerational cosmic trust fund, if you will. Our mandate is to utilize the interest generated by these resources to foster well-being, while preserving and enriching the principal capital for those who follow.
And the text significantly expands what we consider to be a resource in the first place. Sarkar introduces the tri-dimensional concept of resources.
The three realms of wealth.
Yes. He argues that the wealth available for progressive utilization exists in three nested realms. First is the mundane, or physical realm, the agricultural land, the mineral deposits, the water.
The tangible things.
Exactly. Second is the supramundane, the psychic or intellectual realm. This encompasses scientific discoveries, artistic masterpieces, administrative ingenuity.
Human genius, essentially.
Right. And finally, there is the causal realm, the latent spiritual energy and the capacity for existential bliss inherent in human consciousness.
The text uses a specific terminology here, stating that PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory, demands the maximum utilization of all three spheres across the quinquelemental world.
The quinquelemental world. It sounds like quite a mouthful.
It does. But to strip away the jargon, quinquelemental simply refers to the 5 classical elements of physical reality: solid, liquid, luminous or energy, aerial or gas, and ethereal or space.
Okay, so it's a comprehensive categorization of the entire physical universe.
Exactly. And the core argument here is synthesis. If a society fixates entirely on maximizing the mundane, physical sphere, optimizing supply chains to extract solid minerals and liquid fossil fuels, whilst neglecting the supramundane and causal, it will inevitably collapse.
It will collapse under the weight of its own spiritual and intellectual malnutrition.
Precisely. The text insists on the simultaneous maximum development of the collective body, mind, and spirit.
Now, this philosophical framework demands a practical application, which the text calls rational distribution.
Yes, how do we actually distribute all this tri-dimensional wealth?
Right, because grand philosophy is wonderful, but how does it work on a Tuesday? The text outlines a very pragmatic approach. First, it dictates that the minimum requirements of life must be absolutely guaranteed to every single human being.
Guaranteed, non-negotiable.
Exactly. Food, clothing, shelter, education, and medical care are not treated as market commodities or privileges. They are categorized as baseline rights born directly from our cosmic inheritance.
Which sounds a bit like standard utopian egalitarianism on the surface.
It does, but here is where the text diverges sharply from that. It explicitly rejects a flat mathematical equality where everyone receives the exact same physical wealth, regardless of effort or contribution.
A crucial distinction.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Because forced absolute equality often stifles the very human innovation required to progress. If I get the exact same reward whether I invent a new medical device or stare at the wall all day, why would I invent?
Indeed. The text is highly critical of enforced absolute equality, recognizing that it ignores the complex reality of human diversity, ambition, and varied potentiality.
So how does PROUT resolve this?
PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory, advocates for establishing an immovable economic floor.
A floor.
Yes, a baseline guarantee, so that absolutely no one suffers the indignity of starvation or homelessness. However, it equally advocates for a sensible, dynamic ceiling.
A ceiling?
Yes. Once the minimum requirements are met for all, the surplus wealth of society is distributed as incentives to meritorious individuals.
Ah, I see. So if a scientist makes a breakthrough in renewable energy, or a physician provides exceptional care, society rewards them with surplus amenities from that rational distribution.
Exactly. It preserves the incentive structure of capitalism, but entirely removes the existential terror of poverty.
But this raises an immense logistical challenge, surely. How does a society accurately and fairly evaluate merit? How do we allocate human potential into the correct vocations without creating some, dystopian bureaucratic sorting system?
It's a fair concern. The text answers this by placing immense responsibility on the educational sector and societal managers. Under PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, the allocation of human resources is guided by society's most highly evolved educators and psychologists.
So not just bureaucrats.
No, not at all. Their mandate is to deeply evaluate a student's unique physical, metaphysical, and spiritual potentialities. They are not simply looking at labor market demands and filtering children into industrial pipelines.
The source material argues that if an individual exhibits immense supramundane potential, say a profound capacity for philosophy, art, or scientific inquiry, it is considered a catastrophic waste of a cosmic resource to force them into mundane physical labor just to pay rent.
It's a tragedy, frankly.
It is. Society is tasked with guiding them into vocations, teaching, research, the judiciary, where they can express their highest capabilities for the collective good.
And the text suggests this approach fundamentally solves modern unemployment.
Really? How so?
Well, unemployment ceases to be a lack of available jobs. It is reframed as a failure of society to correctly identify and utilize the unique tridimensional capacity of each individual.
Wow. That is an incredibly empowering way to view the workforce.
It's an ambitious attempt to optimize human capital through profound empathy and spiritual insight, rather than mere market forces.
To truly evaluate the sophistication of PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, the text requires us to contrast it against the dominant economic philosophies of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yes, we must examine the clash of these historical frameworks. The theories of Karl Marx, Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, and Sri P.R. Sarkar.
Let us examine the foundational maps of reality these thinkers used. How did they define the world? And how did they define a human being? We begin with the most influential economic titan of the 19th century, Karl Marx.
Marx constructed his entire framework upon the philosophy of historical and dialectical materialism, often referred to as monistic materialism.
Monistic, meaning singular.
Yes. It is categorized as monistic because it attempts to reduce the staggering complexity of human history, culture, religion, and psychology down to a single, absolute foundational layer.
Which is physical matter and the economic relations of production.
Precisely. In the Marxist view, the material economic base, the factories, the farms, the division of labor, dictates the entire superstructure of society.
It dictates our laws, our art, our very consciousness. The foundational premise is that matter dictates consciousness.
The human mind is essentially analyzed as a byproduct of the physical environment. Therefore, Marx argued that to solve the very real horrors of capitalist exploitation, the working class must seize the physical means of production, place them under absolute state control, and distribute resources based purely on physical need.
Now, while Sarkar's text acknowledges the historical significance of Marx's critique of capitalist exploitation, it identifies a fatal structural flaw in his philosophy.
A massive flaw, yes. By strictly limiting the definition of resources and reality to the physical realm, by dismissing the supramundane and causal realms as mere illusions, or, as Marx famously designated religion, the opium of the people.
Right. The text argues that communism effectively reduced complex human beings to mere cogs in a colossal industrial machine. It entirely ignored 2/3 of human nature.
You cannot build a functional, lasting society if your foundational blueprint pretends the mind and spirit do not exist.
You just can't.
The text argues that because this monistic materialist system ignored the deep psychological and spiritual necessities of human beings, it inevitably rigidified.
It became inflexible.
Yes. Without the vitalizing energy of spiritual inquiry and the incentive structures for individual intellectual merit, the system became oppressive. Sarkar refers to it as a blunt and obsolete tool.
The suppression of the psychic and causal realms inevitably led to the catastrophic systemic failures we witnessed in 20th century state-planned economies.
Quite so. Which brings us to the fascinating mid-20th century framework of Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia.
Lohia. Now, he observed both Western capitalism and Soviet communism, and he diagnosed them with the exact same underlying pathology.
A blind, destructive obsession with massive, centralized industrialization.
Exactly. He argued that these massive factories require immense capital concentration. They inevitably destroy the environment, and particularly in the global south, they create horrifying mass unemployment.
By displacing human labor with large machinery long before the society is ready to absorb the shock.
Right. So Lohia represents a brilliant intellectual bridge. He proposed a hybrid socioeconomic approach, frequently termed New Socialism.
He explicitly attempted to synthesize Marxist class critique with the Gandhian principles of decentralization and nonviolence. He thoroughly rejected the Eurocentric hyper-industrial model as unsuited for human dignity.
He advocated for small machine technology. Instead of colossal state-owned steel mills, he envisioned decentralized human-scale machines that could empower village-centric industries without stripping millions of their livelihoods.
A very localized approach.
Exactly. Politically, he designed the four-pillar state, or Chakamba Raj, advocating for power to be decentralized and distributed equally across the village, the district, the province, and the central government.
Furthermore, his framework included the Saptakranti, or 7 revolutions.
7 revolutions? That's ambitious.
Very. It argued that attacking economic class was insufficient. Society must simultaneously dismantle the caste system, gender inequality, and racial discrimination.
Now, Lohia's framework was undeniably more nuanced and socially comprehensive than Marx's, particularly regarding the realities of post-colonial society.
Without a doubt.
However, when subjected to the analytical lens of PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, Lohia's model is still categorized as primarily a socio-physical model.
Yes, it brilliantly addresses the localization of physical resources and the equitable balancing of political power. But the text argues it fails to formally institutionalize the systematic development of the spiritual and supramundane spheres as the ultimate driving goal of human existence.
It's still too focused on the mundane, which is where we arrive at the synthesis proposed by Sarkar. If we contrast the three, Marx focused his entire philosophy on the ownership of the massive physical factory.
Right.
Lohia focused on shrinking the factory to a village scale to protect community and dignity.
Indeed.
But Sarkar's text expands the map entirely. It argues that we do not need to fear advanced technology, automation, or large-scale industry, provided they are strictly managed through the lens of cosmic inheritance rather than profit.
In fact, PROUT actively embraces the most advanced technology to systematically minimize the necessity of physical labor.
Really? Why is that?
Not to maximize corporate profit, mind you, but to deliberately maximize the leisure time available for the population's mental and spiritual evolution.
That is the critical philosophical pivot right there. For Marx, physical labor in the factory was the defining characteristic of human activity.
Yes.
For Lohia, localized physical labor was a necessary means of preserving community cohesion.
Quite right.
But for Sarkar, mundane physical labor is viewed as a basic necessity that should be progressively and aggressively minimized by technology. This is so that humanity can transition to its true evolutionary purpose.
The profound exploration of the cosmos, the creation of transcendent art, and the systematic realization of supreme consciousness.
The text positions PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, as the only historical framework that successfully synthesizes the objective, physical management of society with the subjective, spiritual evolution of the individual.
It presents an astoundingly optimistic trajectory. It rejects the regressive desire to return to an agrarian past, and it simultaneously rejects the bleak futurism of becoming biological components in a state or corporate machine.
It seeks to propel human evolution forward, but, this brings us to a massive structural vulnerability.
What's that?
If PROUT is the map to this highly integrated future, who is capable of navigating it? No matter how flawless an economic theory appears on paper, it must be executed by flawed human beings.
This is very true.
If the individuals steering this system are still operating from a baseline of greed, ego, or narrow socio-sentiment, the most perfect system will inevitably corrupt.
The text recognizes this exact vulnerability. It argues that a new socioeconomic paradigm requires a completely new archetype of leadership to guide this all-round spiritual revolution.
This leads us to the text's final, crucial component, the concept of Sadvipras and the next generation of human ethics.
Sarkar introduces the concept of the Sadvipra.
The source material defines Sadvipras as highly qualified, idealistic leaders who are endowed with profound spiritual power and whose ideology is anchored on the solid rock of spirituality.
Yes.
Now, I must express the skepticism of the modern reader here, because when contemporary audiences hear terms like spiritual leader or a vanguard of the spiritually endowed, alarm bells ring.
Naturally, it evokes images of cults of personality or theocratic dictatorships where philosopher kings dictate morality from on high.
Exactly. How does the text differentiate a Sadvipra from a tyrant?
The text anticipates this skepticism perfectly, and it addresses it with a fierce scientific rigor regarding consciousness. What defines a Sadvipra in this framework is absolutely not religious dogma, sectarian affiliation, or some self-proclaimed divine right.
Then what is it?
The defining, non-negotiable characteristic is an established, verifiable state of equanimity. A Sadvipra is an individual who genuinely, through rigorous mental and spiritual discipline, perceives everything in the universe as a manifestation of supreme consciousness.
The text argues that mere physical bravery is insufficient for this level of leadership.
Pure academic scholarship is also insufficient. I mean, history is replete with brilliant academics designing horrific weapons of mass destruction and brave generals executing atrocities.
Right. So intellect and bravery aren't enough.
No. The text proposes that true, incorruptible leadership requires a state of consciousness that is literally incapable of exploitation because the leader recognizes the inherent divinity in the very people they are serving.
They cannot harm the public because they recognize the public as an extension of themselves.
Precisely. The text structurally prevents a Sadvipra from becoming an intellectual capitalist because their realization compels them to use their intellect for service.
And they are structurally prevented from becoming spiritual capitalists because their profound love for humanity demands they abandon the isolated mountain cave and actively engage in the messy, demanding work of societal management.
Sarkar's writing posits that it is through the continuous inspiration and moral guidance of these accomplished, equanimous leaders that the latent spiritual power in the broader population will be gradually awakened.
And this is how the text envisions shaping the next generation of human ethics. I mean, think about it. We are currently operating under a pervasive, hyper-competitive capitalist ethic that insists human beings are inherently selfish.
That all resources are inherently scarce.
And that life is just a brutal, zero-sum game of survival. PROUT, Progressive Utilisation Theory, operating under the guidance of Sadvipras, attempts to replace that paradigm entirely with an ethic based on neo-humanism.
Neo-humanism. Navyamanavatavada.
Let's unpack that.
Navyamanavatavad is the ethical engine of this entire framework. It radically expands the concept of humanism. It does not merely advocate for the welfare of the human species, it extends the principles of love and existential utility to the plant and animal kingdoms.
And even to the preservation of the inanimate world, the environment.
Exactly. The text argues that neo-humanism replaces the cynical survivalist mentality with a bold optimism. It engineers a unifying social vision where the perceived conflict between individual welfare and collective welfare is completely dissolved.
They become perfectly synchronized.
You promote and protect individual well-being, specifically because a secure, enlightened individual strengthens the collective mind. And you strengthen the collective structures specifically because they nurture the individual's journey towards self-realization.
It envisions a self-reinforcing upward spiral of human development. If the youth of the next generation are educated in a system that explicitly values and cultivates their supramundane potential.
If they are guided by leaders who operate with verifiable equanimity.
And if their baseline physical survival is absolutely guaranteed without the constant grinding terror of poverty, well, their entire ethical baseline fundamentally shifts.
The text believes they will march forward triumphantly, not as conquerors extracting wealth, but as stewards and explorers of the cosmos.
It is a sweeping, structurally complex, and deeply challenging vision of the future. The text asks the reader to elevate their understanding of society far beyond mere political or economic reform, reaching into the very evolution of human consciousness.
It's an extraordinary text.
Let us objectively recap the immense intellectual ground this text has covered today. The source material begins by radically expanding our definition of exploitation.
It argues that capitalism operates not only through the physical hoarding of wealth, but through the insidious hoarding of intellect and the selfish sequestration of spirituality.
It dissects the mechanics of psychoeconomic exploitation, demonstrating how the suppression of culture, the propagation of pseudoculture, and the monopolization of media are used as paralyzing agents to ensure economic subjugation.
The text then transitions to its proposed solutions. It contrasts the monistic materialism of Karl Marx and the localized socio-physical model of Ram Manohar Lohia with the synthetic framework of PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory.
It details how PROUT utilizes the concept of cosmic inheritance to guarantee the minimum requirements of life, while simultaneously leveraging advanced technology to free humanity for intellectual and spiritual pursuits.
And finally, it outlines the necessity of incorruptible, spiritually grounded leadership through the concept of sed vipras.
The proponents of this philosophy argue that to effectively leave the materialism of the past behind and to build a world defined by genuine happiness and systemic justice, individuals must engage deeply with these concepts.
The source material ultimately functions as a strong call to action.
It does. The authors and advocates invite you, the reader and listener, to deeply explore neo-humanism and PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory. They suggest joining PROUT study circles to dissect the mechanics we've discussed today.
They also highly encourage individuals to engage with their digital resources by subscribing to their YouTube channels at Sed Vipras Movement and at Next Human Project.
The stated goal is to firm up the public's understanding of scientific spirituality and neo-humanism, say Suchamari, framing it as the necessary new ethics for the future of humanity. For those wishing to examine the authentic, original source text we have analyzed today, they direct readers to Ananda Marga publication and can be reached directly via email at ampsbooks@gmail.com.
As we conclude this analysis, the text leaves the reader with a profound philosophical provocation.
Yes, this is quite something to think about.
If our current dominant economic models, which generate such immense global anxiety and suffering, are predicated entirely on the assumption of artificial scarcity and absolute private ownership, what precisely happens to the trajectory of human innovation, art, and scientific discovery the moment a global society adopts a framework based on infinite cosmic inheritance?
It's a staggering thought.
The text asks you to deeply consider, if your baseline physical survival was permanently guaranteed tomorrow, and you were completely liberated from the fear of deprivation, what beautiful, unprecedented thing would your liberated mind build next?